"You look surprised," Cale Dravenmore said, his voice carrying across the frozen courtyard like the crack of ice splitting under pressure. "Did you truly expect me to arrive and find rubble?" He did not wait for her answer. He stood at the edge of what had once been described to him as a wasteland, a cursed valley where nothing grew and no one survived. And what he saw instead were torches burning in long rows along stone walls that had been rebuilt with careful hands, smoke rising from chimneys that had not existed 6 months ago, and the sound of children's voices somewhere beyond the gates. Lena Ashvale stood 10 feet away from him in the snow, with her spine straight and her chin lifted, and her gray eyes carrying an expression he had never once seen on her face during the 3 years she had served his court. It was not the expression of a woman who was grateful to be noticed. It was the expression of a woman who had already decided she did not need him. "I expected nothing from you," Lena said quietly. "That has always been the most accurate position when it comes to your visits, my lord." The words landed in the silence between them with the weight of everything that had never been spoken aloud. Around them, her people watched. That was the word that came to him without warning and without welcome. Her people. The ones who had lined the road as his convoy approached. Not to cheer for the Alpha King who had arrived from the capital, but to stand in protective formation around the woman who had walked out alone to greet him. They were rough-looking and weathered, and they held themselves the way wolves held themselves when they were guarding something they considered worth dying for. Cale had not expected that either. He had not expected any of this. He had expected a grave. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. 6 months earlier, the decision had seemed so clean, so reasonable, so completely justified by the circumstances as he had understood them at the time. His advisors had recommended Lena Ashvale for the assignment with the kind of careful diplomatic language that meant everyone in the room understood what was actually being suggested, without anyone having to say it plainly. "Lady Ashvale has become something of a complication," Lord Pemrace had said, adjusting his rings with the casual deliberateness of a man who was choosing each word as though selecting weapons from an armory. "Her influence over the northern nobles has grown considerably. Her counsel has been sought by parties who are not always aligned with your interests, my lord. A posting would give her purpose. The Valley of Korath has been ungoverned for 3 seasons. It would be an appropriate challenge for a woman of her considerable talents." He had smiled when he said that last part. Cale had heard the smile even without looking up from the maps spread across his table. And Lena had stood in his throne room in her quiet way, the way she always stood, as if she were made of something denser and more patient than ordinary people, and she had looked at him with those gray eyes and waited to hear what he would do. He had not met her gaze when he delivered the appointment. He had spoken to the room instead of to her, citing duty and the needs of the kingdom and the honor of being trusted with so significant a responsibility. He had used every word his advisors had given him, and none of the words that were actually true. And when he was finished, she had inclined her head with perfect composure and said, "I understand, my lord," in a voice so steady it had made something in his chest feel wrong for days afterward. He had told himself the feeling was guilt. He had told himself that was the correct word for it, and that it would pass. It had not passed. It had simply gotten quieter, the way a wound got quieter once it was deep enough. Korath had been a death. Sentence dressed in ceremony, and he had known it. Everyone at court had known it. The valley had been cursed for 2 generations according to the old records, though the word cursed covered a great many things in the history books, and not all of them were supernatural. Sometimes cursed meant the soil had been salted by retreating armies. Sometimes it meant the water had gone bad from mineral corruption in the underground springs. Sometimes it meant the people who had tried to settle there had simply not known how to survive what the land actually was, which was harsh and cold and unforgiving and utterly indifferent to human ambition. But the whispers at court had been consistent. No one survives Korath past the first winter. Send her there, and the valley will do what needs doing. And by spring, you will have your complication resolved. He had told himself he did not believe those whispers. He had told himself the appointment was legitimate, and that if Lena was as capable as her, reputation suggested she would find a way to make it work. He had told himself these things with the particular determination of a man who already knew he was lying to himself and had decided to continue anyway, because the alternative required too much honesty about what he actually felt and why he was actually afraid of it. That had been 6 months ago. And now he was standing in a valley that should have been a grave, and finding instead something that looked uncomfortably like a kingdom. "How many are you now?" he asked her, because he did not know what else to say, and because the numbers his scouts had reported had not seemed possible until he saw it with his own eyes. 412 as of this morning, Lena said. "We had a birth 3 days ago. A boy. They named him Korath, after the valley." She paused. It seemed appropriate. 412. He turned that number over in his mind. When she had arrived, the valley had held perhaps 30 people, old. Settlers who had refused to leave when everyone else gave up, stubborn and half-starved, and deeply suspicious of anyone who came from the capital. You brought them here. Some came on their own when word spread. Others I found in places the kingdom had forgotten about. Border villages that had been left off the tax rolls. Families who had lost their packs and had nowhere to claim as home. The landless and the overlooked. Her voice did not carry judgment, but it carried precision. I went looking for people who had been discarded, and I told them there was a place that needed them. It turns out, she said, and something shifted in her expression, something he could not quite name, that people who have been discarded are often very motivated to prove that was a mistake. Cale stood in the cold and felt the weight of every word she was not saying. The gate behind her opened, and a man stepped through. He was tall and broad-shouldered with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes the color of deep ice. And he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent centuries being the most dangerous thing in any given landscape. He came to stand beside Lena without looking at Cale, and said something quiet to her that made her nod once. And then he lifted his gaze to the Alpha King with an expression of measured assessment that was not quite hostility and not quite welcome. It was the expression of a man taking the measure of a potential threat and finding the results inconclusive. "Lord Aaron Vasthall," Cale said. He had read the reports. He had not quite believed them. "Alpha King," Vasthall said. His voice was deep and unhurried. "Welcome to Korath." There was something in the way he said welcome that suggested he was making a choice about the word and could equally have chosen several others. Aaron Vasthall was, according to every historical record Cale's scholars could find, impossible. The man had been the guardian of the Korath Valley for over 200 years according to the oldest accounts, which meant he was either several different men who had taken the same name, or he was something other than ordinary. The records disagreed on which. They agreed only that wherever Korath appeared in the history of the Northern Territories, Vasthall appeared also, always described the same way, always occupying the same position, always watching over the valley with the patient attention of something that did not measure time the way other creatures did. He had not appeared at court in 3 generations. He had sent no representatives. He had answered no summons. He had simply existed in the valley like a feature of the landscape, like the mountains themselves, unmoved and unmovable. And somehow, Lena Asheville, sent to die in a frozen wasteland, had made him an ally. The Guardian has declared her, one of his scouts had written, in the careful handwriting of a man trying not to seem as shaken as he clearly was. I am not certain I fully understand what that means in the context of the old protocols, but the people of the valley treat it as significant. They treat her as significant. I would recommend, with respect, that any assumptions about the simplicity of this situation be reconsidered. Cale had read that report 3 times. Then he had made the journey north himself. I would like to tour the settlement, he said, looking at Lena, and only at Lena. Of course, she said. We have prepared quarters for you and your party. She did not add anything about being honored to host him. She did not produce the particular warmth she had always, in the past, turned toward him like a lamp turned toward a window. She was courteous and precise and entirely, completely, devastatingly contained. She had been the most open person he had ever known, once. She had asked him questions with genuine curiosity and listened to his answers with genuine attention and laughed at things he said with a laugh that sounded like she meant it. He had spent 3 years telling himself that her warmth was professional, that it was the warmth of a good advisor and nothing more, that whatever he sometimes thought he saw in her expression when she looked at him was his own imagination, finding what it wanted to find. He had sent her away before he could be proven wrong. That was the truth he had been living with for 6 months. He had been afraid. Not of her. Of himself. Of what he would do if he let himself understand what she actually meant to him. And now he was here. And she was here. And she was different in ways he could not quite catalog but could feel in every interaction. A distance that was not coldness, but was something more like the absence of hope. And he did not know how to walk across that distance, because he was not certain she would permit it. She turned to lead him through the gates, and Vasthal fell into step beside her, and the people of the valley parted to let them through, and Cale followed, feeling for the first time in his adult life like he might be the least important person in any given room. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. The valley itself was extraordinary. He saw it more clearly as they walked, the way the settlement had been built not against the landscape but with it, the way the stone walls used the natural rock formations as foundations, the way the heating channels had been dug to redirect underground thermal vents that the old settlers had never thought to tap. Someone had thought. Someone had studied the land with the kind of attention that most people only gave to things they genuinely cared about and found a way to make it work, rather than fight it. The fields were covered in winter preparations, but he could see from the soil beds that had been built along the southern-facing walls that they had been productive. The livestock pens were well constructed and full. The buildings were rough but solid, built to last. You designed this, he said to Lena, as they walked between the rows of houses. With considerable help, she said. I knew nothing about underground thermal systems when I arrived. Master Holt, who had been living here alone for 11 years, knew more about the valley's geology than anyone I have ever met. He taught me. I applied what I learned. She nodded toward an elderly man watching from a doorway, who straightened slightly, and nodded back with an expression of fierce, quiet pride. The people here taught me most of what made this possible. I simply organized what they already knew. You are being modest. I am being accurate, she said. There is a difference. Vasthal said nothing during this exchange, but Cale was aware of the man's attention in the way you became aware of weather before it arrived, as a pressure change, a shift in the quality of the air. The ancient guardian was watching him with the particular focus of someone who was running a very long and very careful calculation. That evening, in the quarters Lena had prepared for him, which were spare but warm and smelled of pine and something sweeter he could not identify, Cale sat with his second in command, Lord Brennan, who had made the journey north with him, and who was, of all the people in his court, the one person who consistently told him things he did not want to hear. She has built something real here, Brennan said, without preamble. Yes, and she has done it without you, without any resources from the capital, without support or supply lines or acknowledgement that she existed. Brennan was studying the fire with the expression he wore when he was choosing how direct to be. He decided on very direct. She was sent here to fail, Cale. Everyone at court knew it. And she did not fail. She built a settlement in a valley that everyone believed was cursed, and she did it in 6 months, and she has the loyalty of 400 people who would, based on what I observed today, walk Into a burning building for her without being asked. He paused. And she has the guardian. I noticed. The guardian who has not acknowledged the crown in 3 generations has publicly declared her under his protection. That carries weight in the old law, Cale. Considerable weight. Another pause. More weight, arguably, than the appointment you gave her. There is a legal argument, and I say this as someone who has studied the Northern Territorial law fairly carefully since your scouts sent. There reports that Kjorath is no longer simply a governed valley. The old declarations of protection confer a status that is closer to sovereignty. Cale turned that over. You are saying she may have accidentally become independent of the crown. I am saying that a sufficiently motivated legal scholar could make that argument, Brennan said carefully. I am also saying that the people out there do not look at her the way people look at an appointed governor. They look at her the way people look at someone who belongs to them. That is a different thing entirely. Cale stared at the fire for a long time. What do you recommend? Brennan looked at him with the expression of a man who had been waiting a very long time to say something, and had finally found the right moment. I think you should stop asking me what I recommend, he said, and start asking yourself what you actually want. Because from where I am standing, those 2 things have been in conflict for a great deal longer. Then 6 months, and the decisions you have been making based on what you thought you should want have cost you more than you can afford to keep paying. He left after that, as Brennan always did when he had said the thing that needed saying, efficiently, and without waiting for a response. And Cale sat alone with the fire and the smell of pine and the memory of gray eyes that had once looked at him with a particular quality of attention, as if he were the most interesting thing in the room, and the knowledge that he had thrown that away with both hands and called it necessity. In the morning, he found Lena at the edge of the valley's northern boundary, standing at the place where the settlement ended and the true wilderness began. She was alone, which surprised him, and she was looking at something in the distance that he could not see, and she did not hear him approach because the wind was in the wrong direction. He was close enough to see her expression before she knew he was there. It was not the contained, careful expression she had worn since his arrival. It was something older and quieter, something that looked, in the gray morning light, uncomfortably like loneliness. She turned when she heard his boot on the ice, and the contained expression returned immediately, smoothly, the way armor went on. My lord, she said, I did not expect you to be awake yet. I did not sleep well. The altitude affects some people that way. We are higher here than the capital. It was not the altitude. He stopped a few feet away from her and looked at the same distant point she had been looking at. What were you watching? A beat of silence. The tree line, she said. There have been signs of movement over the past few weeks, something old. I have been trying to determine whether it is a threat or something else. Vasthall believes it is something else. She looked at him with a slight shift in her expression. You spoke to Aaron this morning? Before dawn. He was in the courtyard when I could not sleep. He had found the ancient guardian sitting on a stone wall in the blue pre-dawn dark, with the casual comfort of someone for whom sitting on stone walls in the cold was an entirely normal activity. They had talked, or rather Vasthall had talked in his unhurried way about the valley and its history and the things that lived in the mountains beyond the tree line, and Cale had listened with the feeling that he was receiving information that had been withheld from him for a very long time. He told me about your bloodline. The silence that followed was different from the other silences of their conversation. This one had weight and edges. He should not have done that, Lena said quietly. He said you already know. I know, she confirmed. I have known for about 3 months. Since the spring equinox, when the valley had its first full bloom and the ground lit up silver in the moonlight, and Aaron sat me down and explained several things about my family. History that my parents never told me. Her voice was very careful and very steady. The Ashvale line is not originally from the capital, as I was taught. We came from the north. Several generations ago, Far enough back that the records were either lost or deliberately obscured, my family was part of the bloodline that protected this valley. The silver vein, Aaron calls it. The lunar lineage. It is why the valley responded to my presence. Why the curse, if it was a curse, began to break when I arrived. She paused. It is why Aaron recognized me. And your wolf, Cale said. She looked at the tree line. Has been rather more present than she used to be, she acknowledged. This was an understatement, based on what Vasthal had told him in the pre-dawn cold. What Vasthal had actually said, in his unhurried way, was that Lena Ashvale carried a dormant power that had begun waking up from the moment she set foot in Korath, that the valley had been waiting for someone of her bloodline to return for 2 generations, that the Silver Vein Wolves had been the original guardians of the North, before politics and court life, and the long reach of centralized power had dispersed their families across the kingdom. He had said all of this with the calm certainty of someone reporting observable facts. And then he had said, still in the same unhurried tone, "She does not know yet what she will become, but she is already becoming it. And whatever decision you came here to make about her, you should understand what you are dealing with." Cale had understood, standing in the cold before dawn with the ancient guardian's ice-colored eyes on him, that the word "what" was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. It was not simply about power or bloodline or political consequence. It was about something older than any of that. It was about the way the valley had come alive under her hands, and the way 400 people had followed her into a frozen wasteland and called it home, and the way Vasthal, who had watched 2 centuries of human decisions with the detached patience of someone who has seen enough history to know how it usually ends, was watching her with the expression of a man who had decided this particular story was worth protecting. "The thing in the tree line," Cale said. Vasthal said it is not a threat. He said it is an answer. Lena was quiet for a long moment. "He believes the Silver Vein Wolves are returning," she said at last. "Drawn by what is happening here. Drawn by me, I suppose. Or by the valley. Or by whatever it is that connects those 2 things." She turned to look at him fully for the first time since his arrival, and there was something in her expression now that was less armored. Not because the armor had come down, but because something else was rising under it, something uncertain and steady at the same time. "I have been here 6 months," she said. "In 6 months this valley went from nothing to 400 lives. The soil that was supposed to be dead is producing. The buildings are standing. The people are finding each other." She stopped. "I did not do this because I wanted to prove something to you. I want you to understand that. I did it because they needed it done, and I was there, and because this valley needed someone to listen to it. I stopped thinking about the capital about 8 weeks in. I stopped thinking about what you thought or what the court thought or what sending me here was meant to accomplish." Her voice was completely level. "I started thinking about what this place needed, and then I stopped thinking about it as a place I was sent to manage and started thinking about it as mine." "I know," Cale said. And he did know. He could see it in every stone of this settlement. "That is what I came to talk to you about. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on." She waited with the patience that was as much a part of her as her gray eyes or her straight spine. "I came here," he said, "because I was told to expect ruins, and I received reports of a functioning settlement, and I wanted to understand what had happened." He stopped, started again with more honesty. "I came here because I could not stop thinking about what I had done, and I needed to see it for myself. Whether it was what I feared or what I hoped, I needed to see." He looked at the tree line, because looking at her while he said these things felt like a risk his body was not entirely ready for. "I told myself the appointment was legitimate. I told myself you were suited to the challenge. Both of those things were true. I also told myself they were the reasons. And that was not true. The reasons were less comfortable." He heard her breath change slightly in the cold air. "I was afraid of what you were becoming at court. Not because you were a threat to me, because you were becoming something I could not ignore, and I did not know what to do with that, and I handled it the way. People handle things they do not know what to do with, which is to remove them from proximity and hope the feeling follows. He finally looked at her. It did not follow. If that matters to you at this point, I want you to know that. It did not follow at all. The silence stretched between them in the cold morning air, with the mountains at their back, and the tree line ahead, and the sounds of the valley beginning to wake behind them. You sent me to die, Lena said. Not with anger. Not with accusation. With the precision of someone who needed to be certain the correct thing was being named. I sent you to a place I believed you would not survive, he said. I did not order your death. I chose a convenient outcome, and dressed it in ceremony, and told myself there was a difference. I am not certain there is. Another silence. Longer. What do you want, Cale? She said, and the use of his name without the title was the first break in the careful formality she had maintained since his arrival, and he felt it the way you felt the first crack in ice beneath your feet. A shift of everything. I want to tell you things I should have told you 3 years ago, he said. I want to explain to you what you meant to me when you were at court, and why I was afraid of it, and what I understand now that I did not understand then. I want to ask you, though I have no right to ask you anything, whether there is any version of a future in which what I threw away is not gone entirely. He stopped. I want to do those things. I also understand that you may not want to hear them, that the life you have built here may have no place in it for what I am or what I represent, and that would be your right entirely. I came here to say these things regardless, not because I believe I deserve anything from you, because I owe you the honesty I withheld. Lena looked at him for a very long moment, with those gray eyes that had always seen more than people expected them to see. Come to the evening gathering, she said at last. My people meet every evening in the main hall. They share food and news and whatever needs to be said. They have done this since the 3rd week I was here because it is the thing that holds a community together, the practice of showing up in the same place and choosing to be known. She paused. Come and sit among them, not as the Alpha King inspecting a territory, as a person who wants to understand what is being built here. Another pause. And then we will see. He came. He had expected discomfort, and he found instead something he had not anticipated, which was that the people of Korath were not hostile toward him, and not particularly interested in impressing him. They were simply themselves, a gathering of the overlooked and the discarded and the stubborn, the people who had either been sent away or who had chosen to leave, and who had arrived in this valley and found in its difficulty a kind of honesty they had not found elsewhere. They told stories at the evening gathering. They asked questions of each other. They debated, sometimes heatedly, about the best way to reinforce the eastern wall, and whether the new drainage system was going to survive the spring thaw, and what to name the streets they were planning to lay out in the spring when the ground was soft enough to work. They treated each other as if they mattered to each other. It was the most basic human thing, and it was, Cale realized with a discomfort that was also a kind of clarity, entirely absent from the court he had spent his life governing. Lena moved through the hall the way she moved through everything, with quiet attention, and people turned toward her the way plants turn toward light, not because they were commanded to, but because she was genuinely interested in them, and they could feel it. She listened to the argument about the drainage system with the same focus she would have given a diplomatic crisis. She remembered. Names. She asked follow-up questions. She laughed at a joke made by a woman who could not have been more than 15, and the laugh was real. The same laugh he had known at court. And something in his chest did the thing it had been doing for months. The thing that was not pain, exactly, but was the specific recognition of something that was missing. Vasthall was at the edge of the hall, watching everything with his ancient calm. When Cale found himself near the Guardian late in the evening, he asked the question that had been in his mind since the pre-dawn conversation. "How long have you known what she was?" "From the moment she arrived," Vasthal said. "The valley recognized her before I did, by which I mean I watched the ground stop dying the day after she came. That was my first indication. And your declaration of protection was not a political calculation," Vasthal said, and there was a quality in his voice that suggested he was making a distinction he considered important. "I have lived long enough to have made plenty of political calculations, and I know what they feel like. This was not that. She is the return of something this valley has needed for a very long time. I protect the valley." The logic followed naturally. He glanced at Cale with those ice-colored eyes. "Though I will tell you that if you are here to reclaim her for the capital and the court, you should understand that her return is not something I would permit. I am not here to reclaim her." "No," Vasthal agreed, still watching the hall. "I have noticed that as well. You are here because you broke something and you are trying to understand whether it can be repaired." A pause. "The question is not whether it can be. The question is whether she will permit the attempt." Over the next 2 days, Cale did not press. He helped where he could be useful, which was in places where his knowledge of regional politics and supply routes and trade agreements was applicable, and he discovered quickly that Lena had already done most of the political groundwork herself, had already made contacts with the nearest trading settlements, and had negotiated arrangements of remarkable sophistication for a settlement that was barely 6 months old. He found himself in the position, several times, of having arrived to offer help that had already been provided, which was humbling in a way he found he did not resent. He had spent his entire life being the person who arrived to provide solutions, being the person who arrived to find solutions already in progress was a different experience entirely. On the second evening, he was walking the perimeter of the settlement when he found her at the wall, doing what she had been doing when he found her the first morning, watching the tree line. "It is closer," she said without turning, which meant she had heard him coming this time. "Yes," he said, because he could see it too now. The movement at the edge of the forest that was not wildlife and not wind. "Aaron says tonight," she said. "He says they will come tonight. Are you afraid?" A pause. "Of the wolves in the forest? No." Another pause. "Of other things, somewhat." He stood beside her at the wall, and they watched the tree line together in the cold evening air, and he thought about what Brennan had said about what he actually wanted, and he thought about 3 years of almost, and the particular kind of cowardice that dressed itself as restraint, and he thought about what it had cost him, and what it had cost her, and he said, "I am sorry, Lena." Not because he thought it would change anything, not as a strategy or a preamble, simply as the truth, stated plainly, in the cold, at the edge of a valley she had saved. "I am sorry for what I did. I am sorry for the way I did it. I am sorry for the years before that, when I had the chance to be honest, and I chose comfortable instead." She was quiet for a while. The tree line moved. "I know," she said at last. "I knew when I saw your face when you arrived. You came here expecting ruins." She turned to look at him. "And you found this instead. And I saw your face when you understood what you were looking at, and I knew that you understood what it meant. Not for the kingdom. For you." She looked back at the forest. "I was very angry with you," she said. "For the first 8 weeks I was here, I was so angry I could not sleep. I used the anger to work. It was very productive anger." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but the movement toward one. "And then somewhere around the 9th week, I realized that the anger was about what you had done to me, which was real, and which I was entitled to, and also about what I had done to myself, by letting myself want something that I could see perfectly clearly you were not going to give me. And I had to be fair about that. I had wanted something from you that you had never offered. I had spent 3 years reading more into our conversations than you had intended. That was mine to own. "You were not wrong about what you read," he said. "You were right about all of it. I just refused to confirm it." The first wolf emerged from the tree line. It was silver. Not gray, which was common, but true silver, the color of moonlight on still water, and it moved with the unhurried certainty of something that had been traveling for a very long time and had arrived exactly where it intended to arrive. Behind it came another, and another. They came from the forest in a line, silent and enormous, their breath misting in the cold air, their eyes carrying the particular quality of intelligence that marked the old bloodlines. The gate behind Cale and Lena opened, and Vastal walked out to stand beside them. He said nothing. He simply stood. The lead wolf stopped at the edge of the firelight and looked at Lena. Lena made a sound that was not quite a word, and not quite a howl, something between the two, something that came from a part of her she had not been using before tonight, or perhaps had been using without knowing it. A deep, resonant sound that moved through the cold air with the quality of something ancient being recognized. The wolf lowered its great silver head. "Your blood calls to them," Vastal said quietly. "They have been waiting for this generation. They have been scattered since your great-grandmother's time, and they have been waiting for someone to call them home." Lena stepped forward. Cale reached out and caught her hand, and she stopped and looked back at him, and he said, "I will be here when you come back." And she looked at his hand on hers for a moment, with an expression he had not seen on her face since she was at court. The expression that was not professional warmth, but something more specific and more personal. And then she squeezed his hand once and turned and walked toward the silver wolves. And Vastal followed her, and the gate closed behind them. Cale stood alone at the wall and watched the tree line and felt the cold and thought about what it meant to be a person who had let fear do his decision-making for him for the better part of his adult life, and what it might mean to stop. She was gone for 4 hours. Brennan found him still at the wall at midnight and stood beside him without comment. Which was the thing Cale appreciated most about Brennan, that the man understood when the appropriate response to a situation was simply to be present in it. The ancient guardian took her to meet a pack of silver vein wolves, Brennan said eventually. "Yes. In the middle of the night. Yes. And you are standing here waiting. Yes." A pause. "Good," Brennan said, and that was all. She came back before dawn, walking out of the tree line with Vastal beside her and the silver wolves at her back, and she walked through the gate and across the courtyard to where Cale was still standing, and she looked at him with eyes that were subtly different. The gray deepened to something that caught the torchlight differently, and she said, "I need to sit down," which was the most human thing anyone had ever said in the aftermath of something clearly enormous. They sat on the stone steps of the main hall, and he gave her the cloak he had been wearing, and she wrapped it around herself, and they sat in the pre-dawn quiet, with the wolves settling at the perimeter of the courtyard, like large, patient guardians, and she said, "They told me things, in the way that the old wolves tell things, not in words exactly, in understanding, in memory that becomes yours when they share it." She stopped. "My family was not sent from the capital 3 generations ago, as I was told. They were driven out. There was a purge. The silver vein bloodlines were considered dangerous by whoever held power at the time, and families were broken up and sent in different directions and told their history was something shameful." She looked at her hands. "I am the first of my line to come back. And I came because someone sent me here to fail." A pause that had a shape to it. "There are moments when I think the universe has a very particular sense of humor." "What happens now?" he asked. "The wolves will stay," she said. "They are home now, and I am." She said the last 2 words with a certainty he had not heard from her before, quiet and absolute. "I am home." She looked at him. "What happens with you is a different question." "I would like it to not be a different question," he said. "I would like it to be the same question." She studied him for a long moment in the pre-dawn dark, with the smell of pine around them, and the sound of a community beginning to wake up inside the walls, and the silver wolves at the perimeter, and the ancient guardian watching from the gate with his expression of patient calculation. "You have a court to run," she said. "I have a court that runs itself adequately when I am not there to complicate it," he said, "as it has been doing for the past week. You have politics. You have more interesting politics than I do at this point. I have 400 people who depend on what I build here." "I know," he said. "I would like to help you build it." He stopped. "I am better at some things than others. I am reasonably good at trade negotiations and supply chain politics, and the specific kind of conversation required when two parties need to come to an agreement, and both of them are being unreasonable. I am less good at other things. I am learning." He paused. "I would like the chance to learn here. With you. If you are willing to have me." Lena was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he felt the weight of every second in his chest. "You would need to understand," she said at last, "that this valley is not a province of your kingdom. It is its own thing. Whatever relationship exists between Korath and the crown is a relationship between equals, not a governed territory and its king. Aaron has made that very clear, and the old law supports it, and I will not negotiate that point. I understand that. And the people here answer to the governance structure we have built, not to external authority. If you are here as a participant, not as a superior. I understand that also. And," she said, and her voice shifted slightly, became more careful, "what you are asking me to consider is not a small thing. You are asking me to take a risk that I took before, and that cost me considerably. I will not take it. Quickly or carelessly. If I take it because I have decided to take it, not because I have been persuaded or pressured." She looked at him. "I need you to understand that." "I understand it," he said. "I am not asking for quickly. I am asking for the chance." She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, "Stay for the winter." He blinked. "The whole winter. The whole winter. Help where you can be useful. Be present at the evening gatherings. Meet the people. Learn the valley. At the end of winter, we will have a conversation about what comes next, and we will make that decision with considerably more information than we have now." She looked at him with those changed gray eyes. "That is what I am willing to offer." "Yes," he said, without pausing to consider, because there was nothing to consider. The season that followed was the most surprising of Cale Dravenmore's life. He had expected difficulty, and he found instead that the work of Korath was absorbing in a way that the work of governing a kingdom was not. The kingdom had layers of administration and tradition, and the accumulated inertia of centuries, and most of what he did as king was manage the friction between those layers. Korath was still being invented. Every decision was a first decision. Every structure was being built from scratch by people who had thought carefully about what they wanted it to do. There was an aliveness to it that was unlike anything he had known in the capital. He learned to help with things he had never helped with before. He learned, slowly and with many mistakes, the management of the thermal heating channels, which required a kind of sustained physical attention that was different from the mental attention he was accustomed to. He learned the names of everyone in the settlement, all 412 of them, and by midwinter he could place those names in context, could tell you which children belonged to which parents and which families had formed alliances, and what the various ongoing debates in the evening gatherings were really about underneath the surface argument. He discovered that governing a small community where everyone could see you, and you could see everyone, was a completely different experience from governing a kingdom from behind a throne, and that the former required something closer to actual honesty. Vasthall watched all of this with his patient, ancient attention and said very little. Occasionally he found the guardian in unexpected places at unexpected hours, and they talked, or rather Vasthall talked in his unhurried way about history and bloodlines and the nature of the old bonds. and Cale listened and asked questions and gradually understood more about what was unfolding in this valley and what his presence in it might mean, according to the older ways of understanding such things. "The mate bond," he said one night in early winter, when they were sitting by the fire in the main hall after the evening gathering, "had dispersed. Is that what this is?" Vasthall considered the question with his characteristic unhurriedness. "It is what it has been for some time," he said. "On your side, certainly. Possibly longer than you have been aware of it." He paused. "The silver vein wolves recognize bonds that have been forming before the parties involved acknowledge them. I noticed it when you arrived. I noticed it in her as well, though she has been considerably more careful about it. She knows. She is not." "Foolish," Vasthall said simply. "She has known. She is deciding whether knowing is the same as choosing." He looked at the fire. "That is the part that is hers to decide. The bond cannot compel. It can only clarify." Lena had a guest in the 3rd month of winter. He arrived on horseback with a small retinue, a man Cale recognized as Lord Pelham Sevar, one of the capital's most prominent nobles, and one of the men his advisors had been pushing forward as a potential political alliance through marriage for the better part of 2 years. Sevar was handsome and diplomatic, and had significant land holdings in the Eastern Territories, and had been, according to Cale's court, expressing considerable interest in Lena Ashvale for some time. He watched Sevar arrive with the practiced good humor of a man who was experienced at making excellent first impressions. He watched Lena receive him with the courteous warmth she gave to all visitors. He watched Sevar turn his attention on her with the focused charm of a man who had decided he wanted something and was accustomed to getting what he wanted. And he felt, somewhere in his chest, something that was entirely too honest to be politely characterized as anything other than what it was. He did not show it. He participated in the dinner that evening with complete civility. He managed several perfectly pleasant conversations with Sevar about Eastern territorial politics, and was even genuinely useful in providing context for some trade disputes that Sevar's holdings were involved in. He was, by any external measure, entirely composed. It was at the evening gathering, watching Sevar make Lena laugh with some story from the capital, that Vasthall appeared beside him and said very quietly, "The bond does not require action, but it does tend to make inaction increasingly costly." "I am aware," Cale said. "She is laughing," Vasthall observed. "I see that. She laughs with you also." "With considerably less ease," Cale said, which was honest and also not quite true, because there had been evenings over the past months when she had laughed in his direction with the old quality of it, the laugh that sounded like she meant it, and those evenings he had carried with him the way you carried warmth against the cold. Sevar stayed 3 days. On his last evening, Cale found himself and Lena both at the wall, which seemed to be the place where the important conversations happened in this valley, watching the tree line where the silver wolves moved in their patient rounds. "He asked to extend his visit," Lena said. Cale said nothing. "I told him that our guest quarters had other commitments." She paused. "Which is not precisely true, but it is the answer I chose to give him." She turned to look at Cale. "I want to tell you why." He turned to look at her. "Because I have been doing the calculation," she said, "of what you are offering, and what it costs, and what I stand to lose if I am wrong again. And I have been doing it for 3 months with the particular thoroughness of a woman who has been hurt by careless deciding before." She stopped. "And the calculation keeps coming out the same way, which is that I am already in this. I have been in it for longer than makes comfortable sense. The question was only ever whether you were actually in it also, or whether this was another version of the same thing where I was wrong about what I was seeing." She looked at him with those silver-deepened eyes. "Are you in this?" "Yes," he said. "All of it. Not as a visit, not as a season, not as a version of yourself that comes here when court life becomes uncomfortable and returns to the capital when it resolves. All of it. Korath and its people and the governance structure we have built, and the wolves in the forest, and Aaron's ancient unhelpful commentary, and the work, and the cold, and the morning gatherings, and the evening gatherings, and the fact that none of this is what you were born into, and all of it is what I have chosen. He took a breath of cold night air and looked at the tree line and the silver wolves and the valley that she had built out of a death sentence and said, "Yes, all of it." She stepped toward him, and he closed the remaining distance, and when he kissed her, it was in the cold, with the sound of the valley around them and the wolves watching from the tree line. And it was nothing like the carefully managed interactions of the capital, and everything like the truth. From the gate, Vasthall watched with his ancient calm and his expression of a man whose very long calculation had finally resolved itself satisfactorily. What followed was not simple, and they would both have told you that without hesitation. There were conversations that were difficult, because they needed to be. Conversations about what he had done, and why, and what it had cost her, and how trust was built differently the second time, because it had to carry the weight of having been broken. There were nights when old anger surfaced in her, and he had to sit with the discomfort of it without defending himself, because she had earned the right to her anger, and the most useful thing he could do with it was acknowledge it, plainly. There were moments when his instinct toward the patterns of the court crept into how he approached things in the valley, and she called it out with the directness that was, he had always known, one of her truest qualities, and he had to choose, repeatedly, to be honest over being comfortable. He chose it. Every time he was given the choice, he chose it, because Brennan had been right, and he had always known Brennan was right, and the cost of the alternative was something he was not willing to keep paying. By midwinter, the capital had sent several increasingly urgent messages about the Alpha King's extended absence. He dealt with them honestly, telling his council that he was managing a situation in the Northern Territories that required his personal attention, which was entirely true, and delegating with more confidence than he would have had before this season, because spending 3 months in a community where responsibility was distributed had clarified something in him about what actually needed his specific presence and what did not. He was present at the morning when Lena's wolf emerged fully for the first time. It happened in the open field near the northern wall, in the blue hour before dawn, and it was not the violent and disorienting experience that first shifts sometimes were. It was, as Vasthall had predicted it would be, more like a door opening than a wall breaking. The silver color that had been threading into her hair and eyes over the past months resolved itself in the shift, and the wolf that emerged was large and silver and absolutely herself. The same quality of patient attention and clear-eyed intelligence translated into a form that made the air feel different, charged with something that was older than any politics or court or throne. The silver pack came from the tree line and surrounded her in the field, and Cale watched from the wall and felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the particular recognition of watching someone become completely and undeniably themselves. Spring came to Korath the way spring came to places that had been waiting for it for a long time, with a thoroughness that bordered on urgency. The fields that had been prepared through the winter began producing within weeks of the thaw. The underground thermal systems worked exactly as designed, and the population that had been 412 grew to over 500 as word continued to spread about the valley that had come back to life in the north. There was a ceremony in the early weeks of spring. Not because Vasthall required it, or because the old law demanded it, though the old law had provisions for it that the ancient guardian walked them through with his characteristic thoroughness. It happened because the people of Korath gathered in the main hall one evening, and someone, no one could afterward identify who had started it, began talking about what they had built, and what it meant, and what they wanted it to be called, and what its future looked like. And the conversation that emerged from that was, as the conversations of Korath tended to be, completely honest and somewhat chaotic and entirely genuine. What they built in that conversation was a declaration. Not of independence exactly, because the relationship with the crown was something they had already negotiated carefully through the winter months. Something more specific. A declaration of what Korath was, and what it stood for, and what it promised to the people who called it home. Lena wrote it in her careful hand, and Vastal witnessed it, and Kale signed it not as the Alpha King, but as himself. The way Lena had said things needed to happen here. As a participant, rather than a superior. The ceremony of declaring, which was different from the ceremony of claiming, happened 3 days later. The silver pack gathered in the field at dawn, and Vastal spoke the old words, and Lena stood in the center of the circle with the changed gray eyes and the silver wolf present in her bearing, even in her human form, and Kale stood beside her and felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The court at the capital received the news with the particular quality of silence that preceded adjustment. Lord Pemris, who had been one of the architects of Lena's original appointment, retired from his position that spring, citing reasons of health. Several other members of the council who had advocated for the removal of a complication chose to redirect their energies in ways that kept them largely away from matters relating to the North. The political adjustment was, in the way of political adjustments among wolves who understood power, quiet and thorough. The kingdom's relationship with Korath was formalized in the summer through negotiations that Lena conducted herself with the focused precision that she brought to everything, and the terms she secured were, by every legal and historical measure, extraordinary. The valley that had been sent as a burial ground emerged from those negotiations as a sovereign settlement with trade rights, territorial protections, and a formal acknowledgement of the Silver Vein bloodline as a recognized noble line under the old law. The scholars who had been sent from the capital to review the historical basis for these claims spent 6 weeks in the valley's archives, which Lena had been building from the beginning with the same thoroughness she brought to the drainage systems and the heating channels, and emerged with the somewhat stunned expressions of people who had expected to find nothing and had found everything. "You had been preparing for this," Kale said to her on the evening the scholars departed. "I had been building the case," she said, "for months. Not because I needed it to be valid. It was valid whether or not I documented it. But because the moment would come when someone would question it, and when that moment came, I wanted to be ready." She looked at him with a slight expression that was not quite a smile, but was the movement toward one. "I was a royal advisor for 3 years. I know how the capital thinks. I know what it takes to make an argument that cannot be dismissed by people who want to dismiss it. You thought all of this out when you were still in the valley's first winter. I thought most of it out in the first 3 months," she said. "I had a great deal of time to think. Being sent somewhere to fail is very clarifying." He spent a significant portion of that summer in the capital managing the political consequences of what had been built in the north, and returned to Korath as often as he could, and found each time that the valley had changed in small ways while he was gone, grown, adjusted, refined itself, the way living things did. He also found each time that Lena had a new understanding of something she had not understood before, had added a new wing to the archive, had negotiated a new trade arrangement with a neighboring settlement, had taken in 3 more families who had arrived at the gate with the look of people who had been told there was a place that needed them. She was not waiting for him. That was the thing he had come to understand over the course of that year, the thing that made her different from every version of closeness he had known before. She was building something that was entirely her own, and she had chosen to share it with him, which was a completely different relationship to love than the one he had spent his life observing and had always found quietly unsatisfying without quite understanding why. He chose her completely. He chose the valley and the silver wolves and the ancient guardian with his patient centuries and the 400, then 500, then 600 people who had built their lives here. He brought to Korath what he had to offer and left what was not useful, and in the exchange found something that the capital with all its power and ceremony had never given him, which was the particular satisfaction of being known by people who had no reason to pretend about what they thought of you. There was a night in the late fall of that year when they were at the wall, which remained the place where the important things happened, and the valley was lit by the first snow of the season, and the silver wolves were visible in the tree line, and the sounds of the settlement came from behind them warm and specific and unmistakable. And Lena said, "I want to show you something." She led him to the archive, the room she had been building since the earliest months, and showed him what she had spent the past weeks assembling, which was the complete history of the Silver Vein bloodline recovered from the records that Vasthall had kept, and the memories that the Silver Pack had shared, and the documents that the scholars had helped her locate in the capital's own archives. It was the history of her family restored to itself. The story of people who had been scattered and dismissed and told their history was nothing, and what it actually was, which was centuries of guardianship and power, and love for a piece of land that had loved them back. "This is what was taken," she said, "and this is what I have rebuilt." He looked at the archive and at her, and understood what she was telling him, not just about the bloodline, about everything, about what it meant to take something that had been discarded and make it whole again. "The throne that outlasted the crown," he said. She looked at him with a question in her expression. "That is how Brennan described it," he said. "When he wrote to me about what you had built here, he said it reminded him of the old stories about power that was real versus power that was performed. He said you had built the former, and the capital had spent centuries perfecting the latter, and that the difference between them was increasingly legible." He paused. "He also said I had better not ruin it, but that went without saying." She laughed, the full laugh, the one that sounded like she meant it. And he felt in his chest the specific warmth of having been given back something he thought he had thrown away. "Beyond recovery." "You did not ruin it," she said. "I tried very hard not to." "I noticed," she said. "That was most of what convinced me." Outside, the snow continued to fall on the valley that should have been a grave, and was instead, through the work of a woman who refused to become one, something that would stand for generations. The silver wolves moved in the tree line, and the people of Korath were warm inside their walls, and Vasthall kept his ancient watch at the gate, and the archive held its stories, and the soil that was supposed to be dead kept growing, kept proving every prediction of failure quietly and thoroughly wrong. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? The winter that followed their first was different from the winter that had preceded it, not in its cold, which was as absolute and unforgiving as it had ever been, but in what the cold contained. The valley had always been cold, but it had been a cold that felt like punishment before Lena arrived, the cold of a place that had given up on being inhabited, the cold of something that had been abandoned for so long it had stopped expecting warmth to return. Now it was simply the cold of a northern valley in winter, ordinary and demanding and full of the specific quality of life that existed inside it. The fires in the hearths, the smell of food being prepared in the communal kitchen that had been expanded twice since the first iteration, the sound of voices, the sound of children, more of them every season, the sound of a community that had decided it existed and was committed to the continuation of that decision. Lena had kept a journal from the beginning, which Vasthall had told her to do in the first weeks, with the particular urgency of a man who understood what it meant to watch history happen and have no record of it afterward. She had written in it every evening with the discipline of someone who understood that the account of what was being built was as important as the building itself. The pages from the first months were sparse and precise in the way of someone conserving paper and ink, because she was not certain of her supply lines. The pages from the middle months were fuller, more personal, written by someone who had found the rhythm of what she was doing and had enough stability to allow herself to think about more than the immediate practical. The pages from the later months were different again, written by someone who had stopped managing her experience of the place and had simply begun to live it. Cale read the journal once, with her permission, sitting in the archive on a winter afternoon while she was in a governance meeting, and the snow fell outside, and the silver wolves paced in the courtyard. He read it the way you read something that showed you things you had not been present to witness, which was with a quality of attention that was partly gratitude and partly grief. The grief was clean, which was the best he could say about it. It was grief for what he had caused, seen clearly and without the comfortable distance of abstraction, and grief of that kind was the appropriate response to that kind of causing. He sat with it and let it be what it was. And when Lena returned from the meeting and found him still there, she read his face with the ease of someone who had learned him thoroughly over the course of a year, and sat down beside him and let him have a few minutes of silence before she said, "I would not trade any of it." He looked at her. "If the path to here ran through all of that," she said, "then the path to here ran through all of that. I am here. You are here. The valley is here. The wolves are here." She paused. "I would not design it differently if I had the option. I believe in the journey that brought me to the place I was supposed to be." She looked at the archive around them, at the shelves of recovered history, at the careful documentation of everything that had been built. "And I believe that the person I am now is the product of all the things that happened, including the things that were hard." She turned to look at him. "I am not asking you to stop feeling responsible for the hard parts. I am asking you to hold the whole thing at once, not just the parts that make you feel guilty. Because the whole thing includes this. It includes right now, in this room, with all of this around us." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did what he had gotten considerably better at over the past year, which was letting himself feel the thing he was feeling, rather than managing it into something more comfortable. What he felt was a quality of gratitude that was also a quality of recognition. The recognition of someone who had been given back something they did not deserve, and who had decided to be worthy of it, not through the drama of transformation, but through the sustained and ordinary work of showing up every day and choosing, repeatedly, to be honest. "Yes," he said. "The whole thing." She leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in the archive with the history of her bloodline on the shelves around them, and the sound of the valley continuing its life outside, and the snow falling on Korath, which was not a wasteland, and not a grave, and not a punishment dressed as ceremony. It was a home that had been chosen, and built, and defended and cherished by people who had been told they did not deserve. One and who had decided, with the particular stubbornness of the discarded and the overlooked, that the people telling them that were wrong. The Alpha King, who had arrived expecting ruins, had learned something in this valley that no court and no throne had taught him. That the most enduring kind of power was not the kind you were born to, or the kind you inherited, or the kind that was given to you through ceremony and tradition. It was the kind you built, stone by stone, relationship by relationship, honest conversation by honest conversation, in the cold and the difficulty and the ordinary demanding work of choosing every day to be present to what actually mattered. The throne that outlasted the crown was not a throne at all. It was something older and more durable than that. It was the loyalty of people who had been seen and chosen and given a place where they belonged. Korath stood. It would stand for a very long time. And the woman who had been sent there to disappear had become instead the reason it stood, the center of a thing that was real in all the ways the capital had slowly stopped being real. And she had done it not by seeking power, but by doing the work that power required, and trusting that the work was enough. It had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been, in the end, everything.